Before we begin, we're going to introduce ourselves a little bit. I wanted to explain a little bit about kind of what we're doing here for this specific event. Now, normally when we sit here at events like this, we usually have like a moderator, and we're kind of having like a one-way street of conversation, in this case between Ira and myself. In this case, it's just me and Ira up here, obviously, but we want to make this as inclusive as possible. For you guys here in the audience live, if you guys have questions why we're talking about something, let us know. Maybe give a little raise of the hand, and we can call on you and answer your questions that way. And for those watching live, same thing. Ask your questions to B&H's Twitter and Facebook accounts, and we'll try to get those and answer those as well. So I guess to start off with, why don't we introduce ourselves? Do you want to start off?
Yeah. I'm Ira Block. I've been taking pictures a long time, back to the days of that four-letter word film. And last 30 to 35 years or so, I've been working for National Geographic as my main client. I've traveled the world extensively. There are only a few places I haven't been to, and hopefully I will get to them. And I've been shooting with the Sonys for, I think, about 2.5 years. And the latest camera, the A7R III, which came out how long ago? A few months ago?
A few months ago, yeah.
I've been starting to use it, and it's a great camera. And today we're going to be talking about what advantages the camera has and what you can do with it.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Colby?
we're going to talk about gear, we're going to talk about social media, business. We're going to try to keep this as all-encompassing and as interesting as possible for you guys. So for me...
What about you?
For me, so my name is Colby Brown. Again, I'm a landscape travel and humanitarian photographer. I've been doing this for not 30 years, although I'm only 35 years old. I've been doing this for 12 years professionally. I've spent some time actually working with National Geographic, leading some of their student expedition programs in South America and the Galapagos a number of years back. And these days, I own a couple of my own companies, both in shooting stills and video production for marketing campaigns, photo education, and all sorts of stuff. And we'll dive into some of that stuff a little bit later. And just like Ira, I've been using the Sony A7R Mark III for about a month, actually, a month before it actually publicly went live. So I've taken it all over the world, Africa and Myanmar and the Rockies and all sorts of environments, and have had a wonderful time playing around with it. So I'm actually excited to talk a bit about gear as well as everything else. Great. So getting started with our conversation, let's do a little bit of a deep dive with your career. You know, I think a lot of people are always interested in how photographers get started. Like, what was your starting point? So 30 years ago, like, why did you get into photography to begin with?
Well, I got into photography in high school.
Okay.
And my dad built a darkroom in my basement. We made a sink out of wood and coated it with whatever you coat boats with that keeps them waterproof. And I started developing black and white film, and it was magic. You could watch the print come up in the tray, and it was unbelievable. It was a great experience. And when I went to college, I continued taking pictures, and at some point I decided I would break my mother's heart and not become a doctor. Since, you know, we were from Brooklyn, and, you know, someone had to be a doctor or a lawyer in the family. My sister became the lawyer, and I became the photographer. And I started shooting in college, and I decided that this is what I wanted to do. And I freelanced in New York for a while, and eventually I started working at the Nat Geo, and that fulfilled everything I wanted to do because I got to travel around the world. And the great thing is, for me, I don't do as many landscapes. I try to get more involved with people and cultures. And so meeting people and learning about their cultures is the greatest thing I've ever done, and it continues now. I'm so rich in learning about people and what they do.
It's awesome.
Well, Colby, how'd you start all this?
Well, there's actually some connections between a little bit of our pathways in that sense, where I got into photography not because I have the nostalgic story. I never was interested in photography when I was growing up. It wasn't just what I did. I played sports my entire life, and that's kind of just the avenue that I pursued. And it wasn't until I fell in love with the idea of travel and that notion of contrasting ways of life, of being in situations where I felt out of my element, was honestly, before I met my wife, and I have a 6-year-old son as well, before I met them, it was the place where I felt the most at home. Like when I was just in a foreign country and I didn't speak the language and you had to figure it out. And so I fell in love with that notion of contrast, of challenging environments, of different ways to live. And that's what initially inspired me to want to get into photography. And at the time, it was really just because I felt it was going to be the vehicle or the medium that allowed me to continue to travel. It wasn't anything else. It wasn't that I necessarily wanted to document those things. It was just like, hey, maybe this would allow me to pay for my next flight or to go to the next location. And that eventually spiraled and grew, and I built up more of a portfolio. And just through happenstance, fell in with National Geographic as well. And that, as you know, begins to open up more and more doors. But it's interesting because I do shoot quite a bit of landscape work. Like if you look at my stuff and Instagram and Facebook and social media, which is a large part of a lot of my business revenue, you see a lot of these epic grand landscapes, which I really do appreciate the solitude and the intimate experiences that I feel I have in nature. But at the same time, I too like that kind of draw back to the human connection. And I find that in a given year, because I work on such a wide variety of projects like yourself, that sometimes I feel myself calling to different types of things to shoot. So, like, for example, in a given year, if I shot, a bunch of stuff in, Iceland and Patagonia and all these wonderful, beautiful, amazing landscapes around the world, I sometimes feel disconnected if I haven't had a number of projects that have that human element. So the next year I try to, I don't know if I overcompensate, if that's the correct term, but I then try to go for more of the human element, of the human story, because I feel that that's missing both personally as well as professionally. So it's quite interesting because I think photography means something different to everyone, and finding ways for each of us to kind of make sense out of this artistic medium, to me, is one of the most interesting things about it. Because I feel, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, but I feel that when you feel personally connected to your subject, that you put more of yourself into your work, and that you are more invested. And so I constantly am looking for things that draw me into the scene, whether it's landscape, whether it's nature or wildlife, whatever it is. And if I'm inspired enough to pick up my camera to begin with, then I feel that I put more emphasis on what I'm trying to shoot. And to me, that end up showing in the end result. I mean, in terms of what you shoot when you're out in the field. I mean, oftentimes you're on assignment for Nat Geo, correct?
Right.
And so how do you decide what you're shooting when you're out there? Like how do you approach a story, I guess I'm curious about.
Well, yeah, for me, photography and what I'm shooting is usually about a story. It's about a project. What do I want to say? What do I want to express myself to, and how do I want to connect with people? And in the end, what is the result? So recently, I just finished a project, and this goes to change in the photo business and what you can do, in that magazine publishing is not as robust as it used to be.
It's changed?
Yeah.
Who knew?
People are looking online and looking on their phones for things, but I still want to tell a story whether people are looking at it, however people are looking at it. So I've got a book coming out in April on the culture of Cuba through baseball.
Awesome.
And I spent a couple of years making many trips to Cuba. And my idea there was, I had been to Cuba, been going since 1997. And in 2013, I realized things were going to change. And I like baseball. And I saw that in Cuba, baseball was really a big part of the culture. And they've been playing baseball there since the 1860s, almost as long as we have. So my idea there was, I want to document baseball as the pure way of sport it is before things change and before baseball becomes a big business. So that was how I approached that subject. I was just looking at the culture through a sport. And for me, I wanted to do something that's very positive. There are so many stories now that we see that, you look at the newspaper, you watch TV, there's so much negative stories out in the world. For me, I said, there's got to be something positive going on. And for me, I was looking for a positive subject to shoot. So it was great. I was travel around the country, and it was really an easy thing for me to do, because all you do is show up in town in a small village and go, hey, where are they playing baseball? This was one of the easiest projects I've ever done.
Everywhere.
You just ask that question, and suddenly, they're here, they're there. No one's going to say, no, you can't photograph this.
That's awesome.
And that was one of the reasons I switched to Sony, because I wanted a camera that was smaller and wasn't going to be in people's faces. I wanted to be unobtrusive as much as you could be. And the camera was small, and the nice thing about Sony, you could even see between our two cameras, you get a choice. If you want to, this is a small 24-105. It's pretty new. This is only out a month, I think. And that's the 85-1.4, right?
Yep, the 85 GM.
So if you want to work with a smaller system, you can. And certain times when I'm photographing, I like having the body's small, and I'll work with a smaller lens.
Yeah.
If I'm working on something more commercial, where I don't have to be unobtrusive, then I could bring out a G Master lens, and it works great. So for me, the camera system has two lines. It's parallel of small lenses or big lenses, depending on what you're shooting.
Which comes down to choice, which is phenomenal.
Choice is what it's all about in photography, especially with equipment.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think a lot of the places that I work, like coming back to the landscape stuff, so I spend a lot of time in remote parts of the world. So I'll be hiking in Patagonia and remote parts of Iceland and Norway and Africa. And my switch to mirrorless, to Sony, was purely for the same reason. It was actually portability. I distinctly remember it was like 2011, and I was in the Himalayas, and I was doing some work with the Sherpa communities up there, and the Khumbu region, which is the Everest region of Nepal, where the Everest mountain is it's very involved to get to these locations. So a lot of places, a lot of the hikes, you're looking at like 12 to 14 day hikes just to get to the spots where you want to shoot. And I remember one of those days, I hired a porter to help carry my extra bag, which was clothes and whatnot, but I carried all my camera stuff because I always wanted to have it accessible so I can shoot what I needed to. And I remember, realizing that even at the time, which was, what is it now? That's 7 years ago, so I was 28. At that time, I was done carrying 45 pounds of gear in my backpack, hiking up these mountains. And that was honestly the point where I was like, okay, there has to be another option. There has to be another way. I don't want to sacrifice quality. I don't want to sacrifice a functionality, but I want to try a different avenue. And early on, with the first generation of the Sonys, when I switched over, I used to shoot Canon, my bag weight literally cut in half. Like, I saved myself like over 20 pounds of gear. And but nowadays, you're right. I think now that the lens lineup has increased, now that the bodies are slightly different and come in a variety of different sizes between the A6000 line and the A7 line, you have that choice. So when I want to go remote and ultralight, and I want to go hiking and don't want to carry all that extra gear, then I have that choice. Where I didn't have that when I used to shoot with the larger digital SLRs, because your bodies were big. And it's not just your bodies, it's also the size of your batteries. It's the size of the chargers. Like, all those ounces add up. And a lot of photographers, struggle with, back and neck pain and all this is because we're carrying so much stuff all the time, generally with bags which aren't typically great for carrying so much weight. And so finding that opportunity, or finding that option at least, seems like we're on the same page where it's great having that choice.
Speaking of batteries, one of the things I wanted to bring up is this new camera has a battery that's not that much bigger than the A7R2s and the earlier models had, but this battery just lasts forever.
Yep.
I used to carry a lot of batteries for the earlier versions, and this battery basically lasts me a whole day.
Yeah.
And in the past, I'd have to have, I think, 3 batteries.
3 or 4.
For a whole day. So Sony, the nice thing about Sony is that they listen. I've been in Japan a lot of times meeting with product development people, and they always ask me, don't tell me what's good about the camera. Tell me what's not good about the camera. So
what can we improve?
Yeah, what could we improve? And the battery issue is one of those things, and it's fantastic now.
Absolutely. Well, I think that was a big complaint with mirrorless cameras in general, is that mirrorless cameras have an electronic viewfinder rather than an optical viewfinder. Everything is electronically charged, and so the battery was getting eaten up. And I 100% agree. Between the A7R2, so my last generation, I had the A7R2, A7S2, and the A6500. That was generally like a setup. Sometimes I would run with all 3, sometimes I'd just take 2 bodies. I had 15 batteries with that setup, like where I would carry. Now, I wouldn't always carry all of them in my bag when I went out in the field, but I usually carry them on the trip and keep them in the hotel rooms if I needed to swap them out and things. Nowadays, I have 5 of these, 5 batteries, the Z100, between the A9 and the A7R Mark III. And they do, it's quite ridiculous how long they last. Recently I was in Myanmar back in November, and
where I'm going on Sunday.
Where you're leaving on Sunday. And I want to talk to you about that. But I had the woman that was shooting with me, she had an A7R2, and literally the time that I burned through one of these batteries, she had already burned through 4 of the last generation. It's not just the battery size, which is double in the battery capacity, it's all new circuitry. So the battery was completely redesigned, the circuitry within the cameras are redesigned, and it really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, there's some voodoo that's done that makes it all work well. And so when you get on a plane, let's just talk about what you carry when you go somewhere. What do you take with you usually on a plane? I guess you have to tailor things trip to trip. And what do you check and what do you carry on?
It's a good question. So for camera gear, I will never check camera gear itself. Like, there are times where it gets very interesting having conversations with people that generally don't speak English in developing countries where you're taking like puddle jumpers to get to these remote locations, and you're like, I'm not checking this, and they're like, well, you have 6 pounds or 10 pounds of weight that we're allowing on, and you have to figure out a way to finagle it and make it work. So I never check my camera gear if I can avoid it. The stuff that I take per trip is generally on a case-by-case basis with some caveats. So generally, these days I have the A7R Mark II. I'll also have the 24-70 GM, which I bring around a lot, which is the GM is the G Master line. I'll have the 70-200, either the F4 or 2.8, depending on if I'm going light or I don't mind the extra weight for the 2.8 and the extra sharpness. And then I'll have the 16-35, also the GM, which I prefer just because I do a lot of night photography as well. So I want that extra stop of light at night. The variable that I bring is that next lens if I need it. So sometimes if I'm going to, I was in Myanmar in November, you're going to Myanmar on Sunday, you did a project, you have a book coming out in Cuba, I leave for Cuba on Wednesday.
Look at that.
So
it's a great place.
I was
just there for 2 weeks.
It's a wonderful place. It's a great place for people photography, which is why I'm bringing my 85 GM, because to me it's one of my favorite portrait lenses to use. It's great compression distance, it's super sharp. 1.4 is just phenomenal in terms of your bokeh and your focal planes you can work with. And so that's my variable lens for that trip, where I want to sit there and say, okay, I have my core, which I typically will use most trips, and then that variable becomes that fourth lens. Sometimes it's the 12 to 24G. That's what I just brought with me when I was in the Canadian Rockies. You guys are probably seeing some images back here, taking on that lens, super ultra wide, nice bulbous lens front, which is great. I didn't need to shoot portraits. It was freezing cold up there. I was doing work on ice lakes and with ice and all sorts of fun landscape stuff. So this lens wasn't needed. And so that's my general setup where the gear is essentially going to go with me. I usually carry that in a roller bag when I'm in transit, and then I have a backpack shell that I usually pull out of a duffel bag and then use that once I'm there. And that's just out of convenience. I found that I don't like lugging around my camera gear when I'm in transit. Sometimes it takes me 30 or 50 hours to get to some of these locations, and having that on my shoulders going between flights and things is just not something I enjoy. And at the same time, a little tip for everyone, if your bag looks like it's really heavy on you, the people at the counters checking you in are going to ask to weigh it. So if you're sitting there and you pick up your bag and it's just like, oh, they'll be like, might want to check that one. And so they'll then check the weight, and then usually it's overweight for what they allow it. So having it in a roller bag for me is great because everything looks like it's just zippy and there's nothing in there. There's just clothes. Don't worry about it. Don't weigh it. And it actually works out great.
It's funny because I do exactly the same thing.
That's awesome.
I take all the equipment in a roller bag, and then in my duffel bag I have a backpack that I then, when I'm actually working, use. Because too many times I used to carry everything through the airport in a backpack, but when you switching planes at an airport and you've just been on a 12-hour flight, you have no idea what time it is. You land in some foreign airport and you've got to walk to another terminal for your next flight. That backpack with, say, 40 pounds of gear
Not fun.
gets a little heavy. So the roller thing through the airport, then once I'm there, comes out, goes into the backpack.
Do you use a tripod at all? Because you shoot mostly people.
Yeah, I always carry a tripod, and depending, if I don't think I need a tripod, I have a small Enduro tripod that's one of those butterfly ones that folds up this big in my bag, so I have it in my suitcase.
Okay.
But speaking of that, there have been too many times when, say at night and I'm not working, I'm just going to dinner, I always have a camera with me, and you may see a shot, and you could boost the ISO up on these cameras. 12,000 is no problem. I've done pictures and made large prints at, 52,000. But there are times when I've been walking around at night and there's really a great shot and I wish I had a tripod. So I always have in my bag one of these. It's a little tripod that you could put on the edge of a bridge or wherever. Sometimes you could put it like this, or you could put it against a wall. But this way, I always do have something with me because I've gotten burned a couple of times, and that's when all these little tricks you come up with. You know, once you've gotten burned, you go, oh, I should carry something like this.
That's absolutely true. I carry a similar one. I use I can't remember the brand. It may be Joby or something, but the one that kind of articulates so that you
like
can,
the Gorilla Pod.
Yeah, kind of
yeah.
something like that. Although a little bit more sturdy, because obviously if you're putting a heavy lens on there, you don't want it to like set it up and you back up and then it like swings around the pole that you just put it on,
and your
gear is gone. That's never fun, but it definitely can be handy. For my regular tripods, I usually carry a big one. Again, even the travel stuff that I do, sometimes I'm setting up tripods and I'm doing pictures of temples or other things. I check mine as well.
The tripod I check, yeah.
You're legally, technically, you can actually carry your tripod on through FAA regulations, although that, again, is a caveat asterisk depending on the country you're in and the mood of the flight attendants and things like that. So you technically can, but I find more and more people are checking in them these days. Obviously, there's a risk if your bag gets lost that you don't have a tripod, which is never fun. But again, it's one of those things I find where how much attention do you want to draw to yourself when it comes to being over those bag limits anyway? And like you have your normal bag and it's probably 10 or 15 pounds over the limits of what the airlines are allowing, and you're sitting there and you have this massive tripod which screams that you're a photographer. It's just kind of one of those things that to me is not really worth it. I haven't lost too many bags, knock on, there's no wood here, but so yeah, I don't know.
And the other thing I always carry in my bag, my backpack, in case I forget my cable release, I've got one of these little Sony, I don't know what they're called, but they're remote triggers, and they're really small. And you've got to sort of get it in front of the camera. It sends an infrared signal. So you want to do a long exposure, you could trigger the camera. Let's see if this will work. Here we go.
Doing it live, so
Yeah.
you know it's not going to work.
Why isn't it? Oh, I've got to turn something on in the back here. I've got to, yeah, I've got to go.
There's a setting on all the Sony cameras when default when they come out, the remote control setting, which is in your gear like the little gear icon in the far right
Yeah.
panel, where it says turn on. Otherwise, it's not going to receive the IR signal, which means
Yeah.
it's not going to work, which means it's going to happen like this. So.
Yeah, so you could. I'll find this thing and.
No worries. I use a similar type of thing. I have both wired and wireless. The new Sony A7 R3 does not have the same Sony Play memory support that you had in the R2 and a lot of the previous generations. So you don't have like the time-lapse app, for example. But you do have the ability through the micro USB port to use intervalometers. So I constantly will have one of those if I want to create something. Something like a time lapse where I'm trying to control the intervals of what I'm shooting, and then I'm just manually selecting the settings that I'm going to work with, which is much more dependable, to be honest, than it has been in the past. Sometimes the app would crash in the middle of a time lapse. It was nice that it would compile things for you, but all the people that I know that are shooting time lapse, either professionally or at least at a higher end level, are all using just intervalometers regardless. So that is, yeah, it's something that I carry as well. And yeah, if you're shooting in bulb mode, you have to use it. Because even if you set up a tripod and you're like, okay, well, I want the 2-minute exposure of this, the Malecón in Havana and the lights, the cars going by, you're not going to hold your finger on the camera for 2 minutes and not have it shake. So you need to have a remote control as well.
Yeah, so the cable releases, remote controls, intervalometers are all great tools for controlled tripod photography.
Absolutely. Well, I have a couple other things. I know you have a few things. Let's talk a little bit about some of these little tips and tricks here. You have a bunch more than I do, so I'm gonna do. Let me do one
You do
because you have
okay.
so many.
I've got so many here.
So we'll do. You know what? Actually, I have one right here. I didn't want to put it up there because it looks kind of funky. So this.
Oh, we need. Yeah, we need.
We need
these.
So this is it's actually not for your head, although it can work if you're staying in a hotel and you want to get one of the shower caps. This is actually you can buy these in your grocery stores, and they have the elastic little wires on the bottom. They're actually for Tupperware. I can't remember how I actually came across this. Maybe my wife got them and brought them in, and I was like, hey, that could be useful. But regardless, I use them for when it's raining. Now, it's not to protect the gear from rain or stuff. We can certainly talk about using the cameras in extreme environments, and I'm happy to answer questions about that because I use mine in some of the most remote locations around the world. But it's more so for when you're photographing things like seascapes or waterfalls or things when you have a lot of spray. So what I do is essentially the stuff comes around, and they come in different sizes. So this one's a little big for this particular lens. But essentially, because it's see-through, you can actually focus, manual focus at least, to make sure that you're getting the right composition, to make sure that your image is going to be in focus. You're setting up on a tripod anyway if you're doing a long exposure. There's a lot of rain coming down or mist from the waterfall. You set it up. I usually put it on like a 2 or a 5 second shutter delay. I press the button, and then I'm holding my fingers around the lens, and just before it's about to take, I drop it down, drop it back up. Much higher ability to make sure you're taking shots without those water droplets all over your images. Really great tip, and like I said, it's like $5 at your local grocery store. You get a pack of them in all different sizes depending on the lenses that you have. You just want to make ones that have a little bit of a gap in the front, because the front will get wet and soaked, and if that pushes up against your lens, you'll still get some moisture in there because obviously it's not perfectly water sealed, but it does a great job at making sure that you guys can get images like that without having to look back. It looks great in the back of your camera, and then you get back to your computer, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, there are 500 water drops on this, and this image has now been ruined. So what do you have?
Well, years ago when I was hiking through places, I used to carry iodine tablets to purify water. And I actually still have, when I open some old duffel bags of mine, I'll find the little iodine bottles. But lately I've been using this thing. It's a ultraviolet sterilizer. Have you seen this before?
I have. Those are phenomenal. As
Yeah.
someone that's had Giardia 4 times, these are great.
So you just put this in your water, you push a button, and you stir it in the water, this little thing blinks and it does some ultraviolet.
Which kills all the bacteria inside the water that you're trying to drink.
So when you're traveling to places you're not quite sure about.
It's great, and it doesn't taste like iodine or chlorine, which is usually the biggest complaint when it comes to this type of stuff. That's awesome. Let's do one more each before we move on. So, any ideas? This could go really wrong really quick, so I'll go ahead and explain it. So again, the fact that I love cold weather. Like, my happy place is mountains and surrounded by ice, whether I'm climbing glaciers or whatever it is. I would much rather be freezing, not necessarily freezing. I'd rather be in cold environments with warm jackets than sweating on a beach. It's just my personal preference. Some of you may be beach people, and I don't judge you, but I'd much rather be up in the mountains. And when you're working in snow, and specifically when you're working with ice, obviously we slide around a lot. That's not really a great situation, especially when you have camera gear. So these things are called micro spikes. And micro spikes are a phenomenal, smaller version of crampons. Crampons are what you typically use when you're hiking into glaciers, and I use those when I'm roping in and I'm rappelling into waterfalls or into glaciers. That's what I'll use in those situations. But when it's just a little bit icy outside, or when I'm walking on snow and I want a little bit more traction, micro spikes are phenomenal. They fit over your running shoes, over your boots, whatever they are, and they're great. I used them last week when I was in Abraham Lake, walking on frozen ice lakes. I use them on glaciers. I use them all sorts of places where it's kind of just basic walking around. They're super small. They're not super expensive, but yeah, they'll definitely save your life a little bit. They're great. And unlike crampons that are raised up, like there's no chance of you clipping. Like, I've clipped my crampons before on a glacier and ended up breaking a rib because I was sliding that glacier and my ice axe actually popped up and broke 2 ribs when I was in Iceland once. That can't happen because you're not elevated up. So before, when your crampons, and you've been on crampons before,
you're
so you're walking and the crampons are 1.5 inches tall. If you clip them or you put your foot down wrong, then you can go down and then you slide, and that just can't happen with these. I don't recommend them if you're going full on into glaciers, but they are great if it's just a little bit icy outside and you want a little extra.
With our winter, and if you have a driveway that gets a little ice on it, you need.
They're wonderful. I got my parents some, and they are not on glaciers in the middle of Iceland or whatnot, but they use them all the time during the winter stuff. So highly recommend them.
Yeah. The other thing, this is a really big thing for me, is you get into a hotel in a foreign country and there's one outlet, or maybe there's one and then the other one is in the bathroom. And how many things do we have to charge these days? Tons. So what I do is I get a little power bar like this that has room enough so you could plug in wide chargers, and then also you only need one converter, one foreign converter.
Well, that only helps because you have this long wire here, because where's that one plug always in your hotel room? It's behind your bed.
Yeah.
Right. No matter what, like whatever country, it's always behind the bed.
So I'll
I'll
carry mini extension cords to make this longer when I need it. Let's see, I have another one here. So I'll have like something like this that I could plug this into, and then I put the converter on this end, and this goes to the one behind your bed. And if I need another, I'll have 2 of these. And then once I'm in here now, I have 1, 2, 3 outlets, but I also have this Y cord. So one of these outlets now becomes 2.
Becomes outlet Tetris at this point.
So I've got 4 outlets, because how many things do we continually have things to charge? You could carry a bigger power strip also.
Right.
But it's a matter of your choice and how much space you have.
Yeah, make sure the power strip does not have any protection in it, because you
Yes.
blow it up.
Yes, absolutely. You do have to worry about the type of surges that you're talking about. Depending on the country you're in, there could be issues.
Yeah, I've had a couple of issues.
Couple things
And the
from-
other thing is, I carry this, which would plug into one of these outlets. This has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 USB ports. So with this, I could charge cell phones. I could charge, headphones, noise canceling headphones.
You can actually charge any of the Sony cameras by micro USB. So any Sony camera can charge through micro USB through that. If you forget your charger and you're like, I'm ruined for the trip, it's not true. If you have a micro USB cable that you can just get at literally anywhere around the world, micro USB is the most common cable you could find. You can plug it into the side. The A7R3 also has USB-C. You can actually charge through that as well. So some people actually really quickly, coming back to the conversation we were talking about remotes and time-lapse apps and things like that. In the R2, you can use the time-lapse app and then use the micro USB to plug in and charge it while you were shooting. It would kind of be a trickle charge, wouldn't fully charge. But with the R3, without having the time-lapse app, you need a teleconverter or a intervalometer, remote to plug into that micro USB. But now you have the USB-C port where you can still charge the camera.
That'll take the charge also.
That'll take the charge also. Both of them take charges, which is phenomenal. So the question was essentially that the Sony A7R, or the Sony menu system in general, for people especially moving from other camera systems, can be confusing. It's confusing when you switch to a new system regardless. And the question was, do you have any tips and tricks to kind of work through those challenges or work through a menu system that has stuff kind of in different menu options? And I absolutely have an answer for that. So one of the nice things about the Sony that I specifically appreciate is just the fact that it's fully customizable. So this is actually something that I hear from a lot of people making the switch over. It's like, I don't understand the menu systems, I don't know where to go. Because the fact that Sony allows you to configure literally every single button on the camera itself, if you spend a little bit of time figuring out what your needs are, you can customize every single button in here. You can customize certain menu systems like the FN button menu system, as well as the new My Menu system, so that you never actually have to dive into the menus if you don't prefer it. So I have on my website, colbybrownphotography.com, if you go to the blog, I have a complete breakdown of how I set up specifically the Sony A7R Mark III, including screenshots pulled from my camera, how I customize each of the buttons, as well as each of the custom menu systems, what works for me. It may not necessarily be exactly what you need, but personally, when I'm out in the field, I am almost never in the menu systems because I have things dialed in. I know exactly if I want to change my autofocus mode, if I want to change my area selection, if I want to do eye autofocus, like all of the amazing things that I love about the Sony system are all at a finger's distance away from me. And if it's something that's a little bit more of a deep dive, if I want to jump into APS-C mode and shoot at 18 megapixels over 42, then I have those in like the FN menu system. So I shoot also some video. So my FN menu system, which is essentially the menu, it has 2 rows of options where you have, I think it's 6 or 8 each on both row. I have one specifically, the top one's for video and the bottom one's for stills. You may just shoot stills or you may just shoot video, but regardless.
There are 12, yeah, there are 12.
12, yeah, 6, so it's 6 on top and 6 on bottom. And it's phenomenal. So my recommendation would be, whether even if it's just writing down what your needs are, and then going through those menu systems and configuring it so that you never have to go in there. If it's not your cup of tea, there's nothing wrong with that. Then configure your system so that it works exactly for your needs, and then you will never have to deep dive into any of those places again.
Yeah, because there are 4 custom function buttons, and I have mine all set for how I work. Everybody works a little differently, and so that's the nice thing. Sony's made it possible that you could set the camera up for the way you work.
Absolutely. And it's even with the other buttons on there. You have the dial on the back.
Yeah, the dial.
Up, down, left, right. Those can be configured. The center button, your the multi-stick control panel on the back. All of them. Even if you're coming from Canon or Nikon and you're used to the reverse where aperture and shutter speed are different, you can change those to inverse each other. Like every single aspect of this thing, every single button outside of the shutter button, which they still give a little bit of control over, you can customize to your heart's content. So if you have questions about that, you're free to reach out to either of us or send me an email. I can walk you through some of those things. But unlike a lot of other cameras out there, literally you can make your camera your own rather than have to work with the defaults. The question was, how do we store images when we're out there in the field?
These glyph drives, you using these now?
I don't use those, but I have a similar thing.
They're solid state. Look how small it is. They're 1 or 2 terabyte solid state. It's unbelievable how.
What's that one? What's the storage on that?
Is this 1 or 2?
It's a 1 and it's about $400.
1 terabyte.
Yeah. They're, they're pricey when compared to spinning drives you can get now, but these take up.
SSD.
These are SSD drives. Look how small this thing is. It's great.
They can take much more of a beating than they could before. The optical drives before had the spinning wheel and you had the disk sensor, and so if you hit it, you could damage your drive. The SSDs are exponentially, they're more expensive, at least especially the smaller ones, but they are much faster.
Take up no room.
And they're
But
much
it still
more
needs to
durable.
be connected to a computer to offload your image?
Yeah, you've got to plug it in with a wire.
Yeah.
Now, I do have some wireless little drives that I'll use occasionally when I don't want to bring a computer along. I've got a wireless drive I could plug my SD card in, and then there's an app on my iPad so I can actually see the images, but that's only when I'm really traveling light, and I'll keep the cards. I won't reuse the cards, so I'll go out with, I'll go out with, 15 of these SD cards. These are Sony. These are very nice. So I'll go out with 15 of these, and won't format the card. So this is one storage, and then my backup storage would be on the wireless. But that's not the normal way. So let's talk about a little bit about our workflow, because we have, I'm sure like me, you have 2, one you use in the field, and one you use when you're back at the studio.
Absolutely. So when I'm out in the field, I do a similar setup to that, what Ira was just explaining. So I carry enough SD cards, the UHS-2, which the A7R Mark III utilize for the speed to take advantage of the frames per second and the high buffer to kind of clear out. And so I'll have enough of those to cover for a trip. I think maybe one time I've hit my limit where I've actually had to go back and reformat, but if I can avoid it at all costs, I do not want to format a card in the field when I'm on a project.
How many do you carry then usually?
I have 2 little small Pelican cases full of cards, so they're
12 in each?
Yes. So I have a mixture between 128 and 64. They don't have 256 yet of the UHS-2, the fastest cards. And I use Sony's as well, and so yeah, I have a bunch of them. Only when I'm gone for like a month and a half will I really eat into all of those. But my first line of defense, my first backup is my memory cards. From there, I'll usually go to a laptop. On my laptop, which I usually have, is a terabyte hard drive. Oftentimes that becomes my second. Like it'll actually be on my physical hard drive. I'll have enough space to dump everything on there, and then depending on the trip, I will have 1 or 2 backup hard drives as well. Like if I can have 4 copies, that's like my happy place. 3 is perfectly fine, I'm okay with. 2, I get a little bit worried, and 1, I should be in a different profession. So it's just, to me, it's, some of it is a little bit overkill, but at the end of the day, bags get stolen, things happen. Like if I have 4 copies when I'm out traveling, if I'm in Myanmar and I have 4 copies and I have all the stuff on my camera, which is in my roller bag as we talked about, so I have those things, and I'll have maybe one of my hard drives in one of my bags, and then I'll have my laptop in my other bag. Like the chances of me getting robbed and stolen, of losing, if my airline's lost my luggage, or I got all my stuff jacked, whatever it is, and me losing everything is very, very small. But if you just have 2 or 1 and you're not keeping 1 on your body, like, I'd rather be more protective than not. And so in the field, that's what I use. When I'm back at home, I have a RAID server that I have set up. I use G Technology products, and I have it's a 24 terabyte that I have as my main backup. I have a duplicate of that back at home, where it's essentially just mirroring that backup hard drive, which handles both my stills and my video stuff. And then everything as my third and final, my third and final is essentially cloud backup. Now, this takes a long time for your initial backup. I have 12 or 14, I think, terabytes backed up right now online, and that could take, depending on your service, anywhere between 3 to 12 months to do.
Which service is holding it?
Right now I use Backblaze.
Back what?
Backblaze. Yeah. And to me, that's just the final level of redundancy. So really great tip, or something really quickly to talk about with storage, is let's say you're really meticulous and you're out in the field and you're backing up all this stuff. And you get back to your home and you have, you've done right, or you have at least 2 copies of your things. You have a RAID box, or you have a big hard drive and then another extra one. Maybe you're even smart and you put it in a different room or something like that. And then let's say what happens, your house burns down. All of that meticulous nature of what you've done to protect all of your life's work is now gone, because you had a system where everything was built only in one location. So at the bare minimum, even if you don't want to do cloud backup, even if you, it's not something that's in your cards, take a copy of all your stuff and put it at a family member's house, or just something else. You never know what could happen. Again, it's pretty extreme, but always having your stuff in as minimal, or a minimum of 2 backups, I recommend 3, and then a minimum of 2 different locations for your stuff at home is my personal recommendation, to never have to worry about having your stuff lost. I've seen stuff online where photographers are like, freak accident and their house burns down. Like, it happens. Hopefully to none of you guys and none of you guys watching, but it can happen. And if all of your stuff, all of your eggs are in one basket, that basket goes up in flames too.
Well, I pretty much do the same thing in the field. I try not to reformat cards, but sometimes I am out for months, so I will. But I have 2 of those little drives that I back up to. I don't leave stuff on my computer because I usually have too much on and the computer's just not going to hold it. So I have 2 1 terabyte drives that I back up to, and then I have a 3rd drive that's 3 terabytes, and I'll back up to that. So I have basically 3 copies, and I even, on the way home, put one of the drives in my check bag. And normally I wouldn't, but I'm thinking now, I think, if I'm at the airport and all the drives are with me, even if they're in different bags on me, and I get robbed, everything's gone. So I will put 1 drive now in the check bag.
I do as well.
Yeah, as a safety.
Tucked in a shoe or something, but
just
depending on the
as
country.
another thing. So I have basically 3 backups.
Yep.
And backing up just depends on your personal paranoia, really. The more paranoid you are as a person, then the more backups you'll have. When I get back home, everything goes on a RAID system, and then I have a second RAID that backs up my first RAID. So I have 2 RAIDs, and each RAID itself is redundant to begin with, so that's pretty much covered. Once a week, I back up the RAIDs to individual hard drives. I use a program called ChronoSync, which does incremental backups. It does a trial sync. It'll tell you what's being deleted and what's different. It's great. So the first thing I look at, what's being deleted? Am I deleting anything I really need? And then those drives I leave at a friend's house. Same reason. If everything's in your home and you get, there's a fire, it's done.
Gone. Yeah.
And then the other, I've been thinking about cloud storage, but I realize I do have an actual cloud storage. My stock website, which I do JPEGs of my prime images, is basically a cloud storage for me.
Right.
So
and those are all, do you upload those to your website at full res and then it outputs smaller, or?
I upload full res JPEGs, and then it does it, the thumbnails and however. So if everything were destroyed,
apocalypse happens,
there'd be JPEGs still left in my life.
We're still good.
And I have friends that have said to me, again, this goes to your personal, paranoia. Because I leave the drives at someone's house, say 2 blocks from where I live, and someone said to me, Well, what happens if New York gets nuked? I leave my drives with my uncle in Iowa. I say, if New York gets nuked, I'm not going to be so worried about my images at that point.
They'll be worth more anyway,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Yeah.
what about for people who are still using film or new to using film? How do you back it up?
Film? What's that?
I haven't heard about this.
No, but it's new again. You know what I
It's
mean?
coming back.
Well, if you use film and you scan your film, then your scans are your backups, and you go into that backup system. Any other
Yeah, that'd be the
questions?
same thing.
The iOSafe?
What?
IOSafe, I have one of those. The question is, what about an IOSafe? So an IOSafe is essentially like a, it's not, is it NOS or is it just standard RAID? I think it's standard RAID. It's essentially,
Bomb-proof.
yeah, it is a NOS. When I say NOS, it's network attached storage. It is a device that holds multiple hard drives in a redundant manner where there's some sort of backups happening within those hard drives. But different from standard storage devices, it is actually I wouldn't necessarily say bomb-proof, but definitely fireproof and I think waterproof or resistant, at least for the core drives. So they're a little bit more expensive, but it gives you a little bit more protection for that. Of course, if a thief comes in, they're going to be like, oh, look, a fireproof storage thing, so they're going to take it anyway. Still doesn't defeat the issue if your home is stolen.
But the cloud thing is smart.
But the cloud is the best. Question back there, yeah.
Two questions about the outdoors photography that you do.
Sure.
The one is how have you found the Sony compared to DSLRs in inclement environments?
Okay.
Obviously not just rain, but extreme cold or
Sure.
extreme heat. And the other is I've gotten really fond of the Peak Design clip.
Yep.
For when you have tougher weather, do you have any tips for how you store your camera on or in your backpack? Any chest holsters or something? That you
Absolutely.
Really,
No problem. So the question was, first off, let's talk about inclement weather. I work in places, as I said, I have an affinity for cold environments. I also work quite a bit in Africa. I work quite a bit in Southeast Asia in humidity. Essentially dust, sand, humidity, hail, extreme colds, like that is my average year. So I will tell you, Sony is very particular and very careful on how they word their the terminology when they say that these are weather resistant. So these are weather resistant devices. They're not weatherproof. It's not IP68 or any of those other things. But they, like a lot of other cameras, are very good at keeping a lot of things out of your camera. In the 4 years I think that I've been shooting Sony, I have not lost a single Sony camera in all of the bodies that I've used to any of these environments. Even in the extreme cold, I've worked in temperatures in the negative 60 degrees Celsius range, and that's where like your skin that's visible to the weather, essentially it starts to get minor frostbite like at that stage, and the cameras have still operated, not for a long time, but they've operated. And what I mean by that is that specifically the articulating screen allows for extra air to get behind it. So the only issue I've ever run into has actually been the LCD itself literally began to freeze, in which case I had to get back into the car and warm up, also for my fingers, but for the camera itself. So some advice for using your camera in extreme environments. The first I'll say is I treat my Sony a7R III, I also shoot with an A9 now, exactly the same as I used to treat my the Canon cameras I used to use. Back in the day, this was a 1DX and a 5D Mark III before I switched over. I treat them exactly the same environments. I'm also protective enough of them in the sense that, let's say it's pouring rain on it or it's extreme cold, I'm going to take the time to warm up the camera. I'm going to take the time to dry off the camera and take care of it. I think that goes a long way. I think there's a couple other things I'd like to mention along the lines within the extreme environments. The first and biggest point of contention with it is this little thing.
Yeah, don't throw those away.
This is your hot shoe protector. So this hot shoe protector slides into the hot shoe, coincidentally named, and keeps those open exposed terminals covered and protected. You lose your hot shoe protector, you get I think regular water and rain is not a big deal. Salt water corrodes electronics. That could be more of an issue. So one is keep your hot shoe protector on at all times.
Yeah, there are also like there are 3 little holes in the hot shoe.
Yep.
And water. This is the kind of thing I used to always throw out.
Yep.
You know, I put my strobe on. I'd lose this, or I put a remote control for my bigger strobes on.
Absolutely.
You've got to keep this on the camera, especially when it's raining.
It's all going in.
It's all going in right straight here. So.
Yeah, it's a big one. So make sure you keep that on there. The other thing I'll say is that if you have wonderful hair like myself and you have rubber bands for your hair, you can actually take a rubber band and put that around. If you're working in like a really crazy environment, super rain or a lot of dust or dirt, you can actually put it around your lens mount right there. It's just a small extra layer and kind of just push it down towards the bottom. It will just give you a little bit extra protection. These days, especially with the new cameras, the seals are exponentially better than they used to be. So I haven't had it too much of an issue, although occasionally I will still do that. The other thing that I'll say is that if you get, especially if you're working in very cold environments or cold and wet environments, and then typically you go back into like a heated environment, the biggest issue that I've found that some people have with any digital camera, but definitely with mirrorless, is that they'll let their camera bodies get very wet. And then maybe they'll do a light little dry off, and then they're gonna put them back in their camera bag. And then their camera bag is going to sit, and the moisture is just going to kind of percolate and just do its stuff. And then you're going to get back into your hotter environment, and then that moisture is going to melt because it's super cold. And then you typically get issues. So A is to fully dry off your camera, and the other one is that regardless of what you shoot, whether it's digital SLR or mirrorless, is that you should always have some of those. What is this?
Silica gel?
Silica gels.
Yeah,
I always
those
have
little
silica gels inside my bag, just because it will wick up and pull out some of that moisture and really help.
Desiccant.
Yeah, exactly. You can get them on Amazon, or you can pull them out of the stuff that you purchase all the time. I every time my wife orders something, I'm like, thank you, and thank you.
Yeah,
Take those, and I use them for a bit, and they're phenomenal. And the last thing I'll say about that before I answer your second question is essentially lens adapters. So lens adapters, there are some that are made excellent, and there's some that are not. So depending on the quality of your lens adapter, you are putting on another device that potentially can or cannot be a weak point for your camera in terms of weather sealing. That is nothing that Sony can control. That's nothing that's up to your discretion. I know that using lens adapters on the Sonys are great as a stopgap when you're switching systems. I get it. I did the same thing when I first moved over. But having native glass or glasses that at the bare minimum accept the E-mount, Sony's FE mount for the full frame lenses, is the best way to go. So those are my tips, for the 4 tips for that specifically. And then your second question was?
About ways to carry the camera so that it's accessible. You're not sitting up your tripod, something that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're hiking in a remote place and you're challenging working around, the Peak Design, which was mentioned, is a little clip that kind of can go onto one of your harnesses, and then there's a little clip that also goes onto your camera, and you can kind of slide it in. I'll often do that if I'm hiking in, and Peak Design itself, and you can also have a few other manufacturers create just a little weather camera cover as well. So oftentimes I will put the Peak Design cover over the outside of the body, and then just slide it in, and then you're essentially just picking up the back of the cover so you can see that rear LCD screen and use it there. Again, when it's like super wet, if it's like a crazy rainstorm, if I'm like underneath a waterfall, I'll be protecting my camera as best I can inside my jacket until I'm ready to pull it out and do it. But for the most part, those weather covers are really handy, at least in a pinch.
Yeah, it gets down to common sense.
Yeah.
You know, if the environment's horrible, you've got to think more about how you're going to protect your camera. They're not underwater cameras.
No.
You need to protect them. That's why actually carrying the new Sony RXO, that little one, it's a good idea. You know, that's waterproof down to I think 20 feet or so.
30 feet, I think.
30 feet.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to be crossing a river and I know I'm going to get soaked,
Right.
I'm not going to bring this. I'll bring a camera that's actually waterproof.
Right.
So you have to use common sense.
Yeah, and take care of your stuff. I mean, again, I think that, you know, seeing stuff online and talking to people, and they're like, oh, well, I was using this, and you know, I used to be able to take my camera and bury it into 6 feet of snow, and then it would work. It's like, why are you doing this? Like these are thousands of dollars pieces of equipment that are very capable, and they can handle a beating. But if you don't take care of it, they're electronics at the end of the day. So with a little bit of forethought, with a little bit of the mindset that you want to protect the tools that you're using to create, like literally in 4 years in everywhere from the Arctic to the deserts, literally not a single camera has gone down. Of mine personally, I know others have issues with different cameras, but I used to send my Canons into CPS exponentially more times than I've ever had to send anything into Sony. So to me, most of the time it comes down to user protection.
And also even something as simple as keep your lens shade on in the rain.
Yeah.
You know, it gives you a little bit of protection. You know, obviously when you go like that, you're going to have some problems.
Compared to, 'cause I have Nikon.
What are we talking about in
Yeah.
terms of the comparison? Are we talking about image quality? Are we talking?
quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'll let you speak for yourself, Ira. But for me, when I switched over to mirrorless, it was because of weight and portability. And at the time, I was willing to make even a little bit of sacrifice on certain functionalities to get that weight and benefits. But nowadays, I feel that between the GM lenses and the other stuff, the weight difference, to me, there still is some, but it's not the main reason. The main reason is the superior electronic viewfinder. It is things like eye autofocus that allows you to naturally, using the system, I can track, if I'm photographing Ira, I can press a button on my camera and it's going to track his eyes. And on the new A7R Mark III, it can track his eyes as they close. And then there's like there's this little square that just hovers around his eye as I'm trying to photograph him, and he'll blink or he'll close his eyes or he'll look a little bit to the side, and it will still track him until he comes back and he opens it at that right moment. Like little things like that are things that you just don't get on other cameras, and even if they have similar features, like I know that Nikon has eye autofocus, it doesn't work in the same way. It's not as advanced, and so for me, right now. A, I think mirrorless cameras are the future, but B, I think Sony, more so than everyone else, are constantly, they're innovating in ways that are answering questions I'm not asking. And that to me is one of the biggest things right now. It's not necessarily saying that I want this or I want that. Oftentimes, I don't know what I want.
Yeah,
That's how innovation happens. Innovation is answering questions that you are not asking. And each year that these come out, they come out with new things that I'm just like, I can't believe that I can't live without that now. And to me, that's the biggest thing. The technology that you find inside this, the innovation scale, the stuff that you're getting in terms of the life cycles are just exponentially further along than what you're typically getting with most other stuff out there. Now, the caveat is that any camera released in the last 4 to 5 years is technically capable of creating great images. It's up to the photographer. But the little technology things inside those cameras can make a big difference depending on what you shoot.
The question is to show the histogram and the level.
Yes.
No. The level is its own screen. Well, you actually...
The only way you get it is when you have all of it.
Yeah, no, even all of them, the histogram doesn't show up. Oh yeah, it does on the bottom. You get a live, on this screen, you get a live little histogram, and you get the level, everything's smaller.
But you don't get you can't see.
You don't get the subject.
You don't get the subject.
No.
So you'd have to. So essentially, what you have to do is, even if you're setting, so you're doing landscape. So you sit there and you set that up so you see everything. Then you'd have to look through the view.
You level it,
first.
then you can look at the histogram.
Well, since you have a good relationship with Sony, maybe it's something that they.
Well, we could bring that up.
We could bring that up. for
And
sure.
you know, one thing that Sony's done as far as listening to you, last year Sony invited all the artisans and the Alpha Collective to a conference called Condo. It was Condo 1.0. And we had focus groups and a lot of things with development engineers as to what we wanted. So there's a chance that stuff like that will come out. And I think there's another one this year, 2.0, and this will be open to the public to come to and apply. There'll be applications. So when that's announced, if you're interested, you could come. And when Colby was talking about developments, I'm pretty old school. When I was shooting film, I even used a handheld meter, even though the cameras had it. I used an incident meter. My focus stuff was always, even now, pretty straightforward. The eye autofocus, again, something, I'll never use that. And someone showed it to me, and I'll never use it. And I tried it, and it's incredible. So there are all these innovations, and there are ways to customize the camera. This toggle switch on the back, where you can move your focus point So I use that all the time, and I customized it. I focus usually on, I don't focus on the shutter button, I always focus on the back. So I actually even customize the toggle switch when I push in, does my autofocus. So any way you work, you can make the camera work with you.
Absolutely.
And as Colby mentioned, these innovations that you think, well, I'll never use,
Our lifesavers.
are lifesavers.
Let's do a question over here.
Not about technology, more to pick your guys' brain.
Sure.
If you remember going on the first assignment, country you've never been before, how much of your finding your spot is spontaneity and how much of it is reading and learning about that? What is the spot that you need to be in?
So the question is, on in an early assignment, early time going to a country you've never been in, how much is spontaneity and how much is research?
And is this question for literally like early in our career or now?
By now, I assume you know every spot on earth that you need to be in.
There's always a place you go where it's new.
You want to start, and then I'll do it?
Well, when I first started, there was no internet. So I had to do research in a different way. So typically, I try to do research online. I try to find out about the place. I read books. I look online now. I'll look at other people's photos. I'll get on the plane. I'll land, and then everything's different. You know, what you think you've planned for is never the same. But it depends on your personality. It gives me a certain amount of comfort thinking that I've made some plans, and sometimes they work out.
Right.
But a lot of what you do is spontaneity. A lot of what you do is I'll get someplace, and I'll say, well, there's supposed to have been this house here I need to photograph. Oh, they tore that down last week. Well, a lot of it is asking questions, talking to people, and just digging deeper, and you get great information from people. They tell you things. And I've had wild goose chases also where someone's told me, oh yeah, you go to that town and you speak to this guy. You go to that town, you speak to the guy, and no, he's not here, but speak to this guy. Have you had those days where you spent almost an entire day
Tracking someone down?
tracking something down you need to photograph, and you really never get it because it really doesn't exist?
Yeah.
And a lot of times in your mind you want it to exist, because for me it'd be integral to my story.
Yeah.
You know, you go, wow, that would be a great image to complete my story.
Right.
And you want it to exist, and you're trying to find it, and it just doesn't happen.
exist. Well, I agree. I mean, I think there are benefits to planning. I think there's benefits to research. I think I would never go into a situation without having done some of that. But I think it's with the caveat that there are so many variables that you don't control in photography and in life in general, that to me, the organic moments are the ones that, at least in my career, have probably created some of the most exceptional work, is where, whether I planned ahead and I had this vision for a specific photograph or not, but you get to the ground and reality doesn't always, equate to what you envisioned. And to me, that's kind of also the hallmark of a very good photographer. Adapting on your feet, understanding that we are documenting the world around us, regardless of what we're photographing, landscape, travel, people, regardless of what it is that it's our ability to adapt to changing environments and to work through those challenges and to come away with something exceptional, to me is huge. And it's something that you learn over time. I mean, I've been doing this for 12 years. Ira's been doing this for 30. Like, when we approach a scene, we have ideas already of how we're going to try to photograph things. Like, it's muscle memory. At the same time, we're still organically going through a process. Like, in our head, we might be like, this could be a great shot. And then we look at the camera and we're like, and I was wrong. So let me try to work it out. But you have a starting point. And so, long-winded answer, I think that it's important to plan, it's important to do your research, but at the end of the day, you got to adjust to the variables that are way outside your control. And oftentimes, very few times in my career, maybe because of the type of work that I shoot, has I've ever been like, envisioned a perfect image and then got there and then all the variables were lined up and it was exactly how it worked. It was, you know, meant to work out. I could think of maybe one or two out of, you know, tens of thousands and thousands of images. Oftentimes it's like, I want to go and I want to document this experience, and then you're pulling out the best piece of that experience that you can to tell that story.
You know, part of the beauty of being a photographer is the exploration.
Yeah.
It's just getting deep into something and seeing where it leads you and learning about things. It's, to me, that's the greatest experiences, meeting these people, following these roads, discovering new things. It's no one, these are things you can't explain to people. You could show people your pictures, but when I look at a picture, I think not only about the picture, but about the path that took me to get there.
Right.
That's, you know, that's one of the, so
amazing.
I don't mind that happening.
All right, so the question is about gear. What do we use, and what are the difference between a few of the different model lines? And we'll probably use this as probably our last question because I think we're running out of time. So right now we both shoot with the A7R3 and the A9.
A9, yeah.
And the A9.
And
so
we have the older.
we have most of the other models as well. So the A7R3, the newest model, to me is probably the most significant kind of all-around camera.
Right, the best compromise.
Dynamic range, autofocus, speed, like everything. Like it is kind of the jack of all trades. Master of a few, but not necessarily everything. The A9 to me is like the pinnacle of autofocus perfection in the industry right now. Like
a Lamborghini, it's fast.
Exactly, super fast, super high frame rates. It's more, to me, I use it more for wildlife than anything else, but it's like a wildlife sports camera in terms of the high frames per second, and it has a dedicated, dedicated CPUs just for autofocus tracking, things like that. The A7S II, the S stands for sensitivity, is more of the videographer's camera. So you're shooting in, you have nice bit rates. You're shooting in 4K. You're shooting at proper full frame resolution at 35 millimeters. Whereas some of the other bodies, it looks better if you're shooting in Super 35. These are all very technical terms, but essentially the A7S II, if you were really into video, I'd recommend that camera. If you're looking for the most all around, I'd say the A7R Mark III. And if you were dabbling in things like sports or wildlife, it doesn't get better than the A9.
And really, the advantages of the new A9 and A7R III, besides the super great autofocus, the great responsiveness, and the battery.
Yeah, the battery.
This battery is a game changer.
It's huge.
So you don't have to.
The A9 battery?
A9 and the A7R3 are both the same battery.
Same battery. So that would, if you're just getting into and looking for a new camera, you might as well get the one that has a better battery.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Absolutely.
What is your website?
My website is colbybrownphotography.com. If any of you guys had questions and you guys watching live about setting up the A7R Mark III, check out, I did a blog post on about fully customizing it and everything that I do and why I do it and what settings are important and things like that. It's worth, I'm biased, but I think it's worth checking out.
And don't forget to follow us on Instagram,
Absolutely.
right? At Ira Block Photo.
And Colby Brown Photography. For all of you guys, please check out Sony Alpha Universe, or alphauniverse.com as well. There's lots of information for all the new Sony bodies, Sony artisans, all sorts of great stuff on there, so check that out as well. Thank you guys.